It was a bright summer afternoon in London, and the streets near the historic palace were full of excited tourists. People from all over the world had gathered to take pictures, admire the grand architecture, and watch the famous royal guards. These guards were known for their discipline. They stood still, dressed in their red coats and tall black hats, never reacting to anything around them. Among the tourists was a young man named Jake. He had come from America with a group of friends, eager to explore Europe and experience new adventures. Jake loved having fun, but sometimes he took things too far. He enjoyed making people laugh, even if it meant acting a little foolish. That day, as he and his friends walked near the palace, he saw the guards standing like statues and got an idea. "Hey, look at that guy. He doesn't even blink," Jake said, pointing at one of the guards. His friends chuckled, and one of them nudged him. "They're trained to do that. Nothing makes them move," one of them said. Jake smirked. "Oh yeah, let's see about that." At first, he tried harmless things. He waved his hands in front of the guard's face, made funny faces, and even jumped up and down. The guard didn't react at all. His face was serious, his eyes focused straight ahead. The tourists nearby watched with amusement, some shaking their heads. They had seen people like Jake before, tourists who tried to test the guards. But Jake wasn't ready to stop. He wanted to get a reaction. He took a step closer and clapped his hands loudly, right next to the guard's ear. Still, no response. His friends laughed, but some people in the crowd frowned. "Show some respect," an older woman muttered as she walked past. Jake ignored her. He wanted to prove that the guards were just normal people, that they couldn't stay still forever. Then, without thinking, he grabbed a glass bottle of soda he had been drinking and raised it in the air. "Let's see if this gets his attention," he said, his voice full of excitement. Before anyone could stop him, he let the bottle slip from his fingers. It hit the ground right in front of the guard and shattered into tiny pieces. A loud cracking sound filled the air as glass scattered at the guard's feet. The crowd gasped, some stepping back in shock. The air became heavy with silence. Everyone's eyes turned to the guard. Surely this would make him move. Surely he would say something, show some emotion, or maybe even call for help. But what happened next left Jake speechless. The guard didn't move an inch. He didn't flinch, didn't glance down at the broken glass, didn't even blink. He just stood there, as if nothing had happened. Jake felt a strange chill run down his spine. For the first time that day, he wasn't laughing. For a moment, everything was silent. The sound of the glass breaking had made the entire crowd freeze. People looked at Jake, then at the royal guard, waiting for something to happen. But the guard didn't move. He stood tall, his face as calm as ever, as if nothing had happened. Jake had expected some kind of reaction. Maybe the guard would yell at him, step back, or at least look down. But nothing. The way the guard remained still made Jake feel something strange. It wasn't the fun excitement he had felt earlier. This was different. His heart beat a little faster, and he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His friends, who had been laughing before, had now gone quiet. One of them cleared his throat and whispered, maybe we should go." Jake swallowed hard. He looked around and saw that some people were staring at him with disapproval. Others shook their heads, clearly disappointed by what he had done. A father standing nearby placed a hand on his young son's shoulder and said in a serious tone, "This is why we always respect people who serve." Hearing those words made Jake feel even more uncomfortable. He hadn't thought about the guards like that. To him, they were just part of the tourist experience, like statues that people took pictures with. But now, looking at the guards standing firm despite what had happened, Jake realized something. This was not just a man in a uniform. He was a soldier. A deep voice suddenly broke the silence. "Step back, sir." Jake turned and saw a security officer walking towards him. The man wore a dark uniform and had a professional but stern expression on his face. He wasn't yelling, but his presence alone made it clear that this was serious. Jake felt his stomach tighten. It was just a joke, he said quickly, raising his hand slightly. The officer didn't smile. This isn't a joke, he replied firmly. You've disrespected a member of the Royal Guard and created a potential safety hazard. Jake opened his mouth to argue, but he stopped himself. He glanced down at the broken glass and suddenly felt embarrassed. The guard was still standing there, as steady as ever, and for the first time, Jake saw him in a different light. The officer continued, "You need to understand that these men are not here for entertainment. They are highly trained soldiers, standing watch to protect this place. They don't react because discipline is their duty." Jake felt a lump in his throat. He had been so focused on trying to make the guard react that he hadn't thought about the meaning behind his stillness. The crowd was still watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Jake took a deep breath and looked at the officer. I didn't mean to be disrespectful," he said quietly. The officer studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Come with me," he said. Jake felt his heart sink. This wasn't how he had expected his day to go. Jake felt his legs grow heavy as he followed the security officer away from the crowd. His friends didn't say a word. They just stood there, watching him go. The broken glass still lay scattered at the guard's feet, but the soldier remained as still as ever, as if the entire incident had never happened. The silence in the air felt heavier than before. Jake had never thought much about discipline, but now, seeing the guard stand tall and unaffected, he felt something unfamiliar: respect. As they walked toward a small security post near the palace entrance, Jake finally found his voice. I really didn't mean any harm," he said, trying to sound calm. "I was just messing around." The officer glanced at him but didn't slow down. "Messing around," he repeated. "Tell me something, son. Would you walk up to a firefighter or a police officer and do what you just did?" Jake hesitated. "Well, no," he admitted. The officer stopped and turned to face him. "Then why do you think it's okay to do that to a soldier?" Jake opened his mouth to answer but found that he had no good excuse. He had never thought of the Royal Guards as real soldiers. To him, they were just part of the London experience, like the red buses and double-decker tours. But now, standing here, he realized how wrong he had been. The officer sighed and crossed his arms. "You're lucky," he said. "If this had been taken more seriously, you could have been fined or even arrested for public misconduct. Do you understand that?" Jake nodded slowly. He hadn't meant to cause trouble, but looking back, he saw how foolish he had been. The crowd, the laughter, the excitement, it had all made him forget that he was standing in front of a man who had dedicated his life to duty. The officer's expression softened slightly. "Let me tell you something about these guards," he said. "They go through intense training, just like any soldier. They are taught to stand firm no matter what happens. It's not just about looking strong. It's about real discipline, about keeping their focus even in the face of distractions." Jake listened carefully. For the first time, he saw the guard not as an unshakable statue, but as a person, someone who had worked hard to master self-control. The officer continued, "That guard you tried to provoke, he might have served in actual combat. He might have put his life on the line for his country. But here, in this moment, his job is to stand watch, and he does it with pride." Jake lowered his head, feeling ashamed. "I get it now," he murmured. The officer nodded. "Good. Then learn from this." As Jake stood there, the lesson sank in. This wasn't just about a broken bottle or a harmless prank. It was about respect, something he had failed to give but would never forget again. Jake stood there, his mind racing with everything the officer had just told him. He had come to the palace that day expecting to have fun, take pictures, and maybe get a good laugh. But now he felt something completely different: regret. The officer's words kept echoing in his mind. That guard might have served in actual combat. Jake had never thought about that before. The man standing still in front of the palace wasn't just some tourist attraction. He was a trained soldier, someone who had dedicated his life to discipline and duty. And Jake had disrespected him without even thinking twice. The officer took a deep breath and looked at Jake carefully. "Look, kid," he said, his voice a little calmer now. "I don't think you're a bad person, but what you did was foolish and unnecessary. People don't always realize it, but these guards take their duty seriously. They aren't here for fun, and they don't react because they are trained not to. It's their job." Jake nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. The officer sighed and pointed back toward the guard still standing at his post. "You see him?" he asked. "That man has been standing there for hours, in the heat, in the cold, in the rain, without moving, without showing any sign of discomfort. That takes strength, more strength than most people realize." Jake followed the officer's gaze. The guard was still there, as if nothing had happened. The broken glass had been cleaned up by another palace worker, but the moment still felt fresh in Jake's mind. He swallowed hard. I get it now," he admitted. "I was just trying to be funny, but I didn't think about what it meant. I didn't think about him." The officer gave him a long look, then nodded. "That's the first step, understanding. But respect isn't just about knowing something. It's about changing how you act." Jake took a deep breath. He had never really thought about respect in that way before. Sure, he had been taught to be polite to his teachers, to say thank you and sorry when needed, but this was different. This was about honoring someone's dedication, even when they didn't demand it. The officer crossed his arms. "I could write you up for public disturbance," he said, "but I'm going to give you a chance to walk away and learn from this. If you really understand what I'm saying, you won't make this mistake again." Jake felt a wave of relief, but more than that, he felt determined. "I promise," he said. "I won't." The officer gave him a small nod. "Then go. And remember, respect is earned, but it should also be given." As Jake walked away, his friends waiting for him nearby, he knew one thing for sure. He would never forget this lesson. Jake walked back toward his friends, his mind still replaying everything that had just happened. The crowd had mostly moved on, but a few people still gave him disapproving looks as he passed. His friends stood quietly, their earlier laughter completely gone. One of them, Mark, finally spoke. "Dude, that was intense." Jake sighed and nodded. "Yeah, I messed up." For the first time that day, he wasn't making excuses, wasn't laughing it off. He had never really thought about respect in this way before. He had always assumed that as long as something was funny to him and his friends, it was okay. But now, standing in the middle of London, he realized how wrong that was. Another friend, Eric, kicked at the pavement. "I mean, we were all kinda laughing, but when that officer started talking about the guard, it hit different, you know." Jake nodded. He knew exactly what Eric meant. At first, it had all been a joke, just something silly to make the day more exciting. But the moment the security officer had spoken about the guard's discipline and training, everything changed. That guard wasn't just standing there because he had to. He was standing there because he had committed himself to duty, to honor, and to protecting something bigger than himself. Jake took a deep breath and turned to look at the guard one last time. The man was still there, still standing tall, still silent. Jake had tried everything to break his focus. But now, all he felt was admiration. He had spent his whole life thinking strength was about being loud, being bold, making people notice you. But this man had shown a different kind of strength, one that didn't need words or reactions. It was a quiet strength, the kind that spoke without saying anything at all. "I feel bad," Jake admitted. "Like, really bad. I didn't think about what I was doing. I just wanted to get a reaction. But that guy, he's stronger than me in ways I never even understood." Mark patted his shoulder. "Well, at least you learned something. Better late than never, Right. Jake nodded, but he still felt like he had to do something. He wasn't sure what, but just walking the way didn't feel right. After a moment of hesitation, he stepped forward again, this time not to bother the guard but to show his respect. He stopped a few feet away, placed his hands at his sides, and gave a small, respectful nod. The guard, of course, didn't react. But that wasn't the point. Jake wasn't looking for a reaction anymore. He was simply showing that he understood. As he turned and walked away, he felt different. He had come to the palace that day as just another tourist looking for fun. But he was leaving with something far more valuable, a lesson about discipline, respect, and true strength. And it was a lesson he would never forget. As Jake and his friends walked away from the palace, the mood among them was different. No more joking, no more laughter, just quiet thoughts. The city buzzed with life around them, but inside, Jake felt a strange mix of emotions. He had never been the type to think deeply about his actions. Life had always been about fun, about living in the moment. But today was different. Today, he had learned something that no classroom, no book, and no lecture had ever taught him. Respect. The word echoed in his mind. Not the kind of respect that came from fear or the kind people demanded. No, this was something else. Respect for discipline, for duty, for those who carried responsibilities far greater than their own. Mark broke the silence first. So, what now? Jake thought for a moment before answering. I don't know, but I do know one thing. I need to stop acting like everything is just a joke. Eric nodded. Yeah, I mean, we were all kinda in on it, but watching that guard, man, that was something else. He didn't even flinch. Jake exhaled, because he didn't have to. He's stronger than that. They walked in silence for a while, taking in the sights of London. The grand buildings, the people rushing by, the mix of old and new all around them. But for Jake, the most important thing he had seen that day wasn't a famous landmark or a historical monument. It was a man in uniform, standing tall, refusing to be shaken. Eventually, they reached a small cafe and decided to sit down for a while. Jake's mind was still heavy with thoughts, but there was one thing he couldn't shake, the need to make things right. He looked up at his friends. I think I want to apologize. Mark raised an eyebrow. To who? The guard. Eric scoffed. Dude, you really think he's gonna respond? Jake shook his head. No, I don't. But that's not the point. It's not about getting a reaction. It's about owning up to what I did. For the first time in a long time, Jake wasn't thinking about himself. He wasn't thinking about what was funny or what would impress people. He was thinking about what was right. Mark leaned back in his chair. Well, I guess there's no harm in trying. Jake nodded. He didn't know exactly how he would do it, but he knew he had to. Maybe he would write a letter. Maybe he would return to the palace the next day. Maybe he would just stand there in quiet respect. But one thing was certain. This lesson wasn't going to be forgotten. He had come to London as just another tourist, but he was leaving with a new understanding of what true strength and respect really meant. The next morning, Jake woke up with a clear purpose in his mind. He had spent the entire night thinking about what had happened at the palace. He had replayed the moment again and again. The sound of the bottle breaking, the guard's unshaken stance, the words of the security officer. Every detail was stuck in his head. He knew he had to do something. His friends were still asleep, but Jake quietly got dressed and slipped out of the hotel. The streets of London were already alive with activity. People heading to work, tourists with cameras, street performers setting up their spots. But Jake wasn't paying attention to any of it. He had only one destination in mind. When he reached the palace, he felt his heart beat faster. The place looked the same as the day before. Grand, historic, full of visitors taking photos. The guards were standing at their posts, as disciplined as ever. Jake scanned the area and quickly spotted the one he had tried to provoke the day before. He swallowed hard. How was he supposed to apologize to someone who wouldn't even respond? Taking a deep breath, he walked closer, stopping at a respectful distance. He didn't speak. He knew it was pointless. Instead, he simply stood there for a moment, looking at the guard, truly seeing him. Then, in the quietest but most sincere way he knew how, Jake straightened his back, placed his hands at his sides, and gave a small, respectful nod. He didn't expect anything in return. He knew the guard wouldn't move, wouldn't speak, but that didn't matter. This wasn't about getting a reaction. It was about showing respect. After a few moments, he stepped back and turned to leave. But just as he was about to go, something unexpected happened. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the guard slightly shift his stance. Just the tiniest movement, so small that most people wouldn't have even noticed it. But Jake did. It wasn't much. It wasn't a smile or a nod or even eye contact. But to Jake, it meant everything. He walked away with a strange feeling in his chest. Not pride, not relief, but something deeper. He had learned a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. Respect wasn't about words. It wasn't about proving something to others. It was about understanding, about appreciating the strength of those who stood firm, about giving honor where it was due. As he made his way back to the hotel, Jake felt lighter than he had the day before. He hadn't just come back to apologize. He had come back to show that he had changed. And in the end, that was all that really mattered. As Jake walked away from the palace, he felt different, like something inside him had shifted. He had come back not to erase what he had done, but to face it. And even though the guard had remained still, that small shift in stance had spoken louder than words. It was a moment he would never forget. When he returned to the hotel, his friends were awake, waiting for him. Mark raised an eyebrow. "Where'd you go?" Jake hesitated for a second, then answered honestly, "Back to the palace." Eric looked surprised. "Seriously? What for?" Jake sat down on the couch, rubbing his hands together. I needed to do something. I wanted to show respect. I know the guard wasn't going to react or anything, but I had to go back. I had to own up to what I did, even if it was just in my own way." His friends exchanged glances. It was clear that none of them had expected this from Jake. Mark leaned forward. "So, do you feel better?" Jake thought for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I do." For the rest of the trip, Jake found himself looking at things differently. He noticed the people around him more. The police officers directing traffic, the street cleaners working early in the morning, the waiters serving food with a smile even when they were busy. He had never thought much about these people before, but now he saw them in a new light. He realized that respect wasn't just about the big things, like soldiers standing guard. It was about appreciating the dedication of people in all kinds of roles, people who worked hard even when no one noticed. On the last day of their trip, as they packed their bags, Mark smirked at Jake. "So, did London change you?" Jake chuckled. "A little, yeah." Eric grinned. "Well, at least you didn't get arrested." They all laughed, but Jake knew deep down that this trip had been more than just a vacation. He had learned something that would stay with him forever. When he got home, he told his family about what had happened. His dad listened carefully, then smiled. "That's a good lesson, son," he said. "Respect isn't about whether someone demands it. It's about recognizing people's dedication, even when they don't ask for it." Jake nodded. He understood that now. As the days passed, he noticed the change in himself. He no longer took things for granted the way he used to. Whether it was a teacher in class, a worker at a store, or even a stranger doing their job, he saw them differently. He saw their efforts. He saw their discipline. And most of all, he saw their quiet strength. And from that day on, he made sure to give them the respect they deserved.